Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. It feels like ages since I've posted something. A lot's been going on. I think somewhere in there I may have even contracted COVID and been out of commission for a few weeks. I didn't get tested because I rarely go out in public, and even though whatever it was hung on for a while, it never got to a point where I felt I was in any sort of medical jeopardy or had to go to an ER. I know that unlike some content creators, I'm doing this as a sideline and not a day job, but I still like to try and put out at least one episode a month. And even though nobody was stressing it, except for me, I felt it as time went by and I wasn't posting. I was, though, in contact with someone I actually interviewed during that time, and we're working on edits. I was hoping to get the edits completed and get the episode up a few weeks ago, but we had to delay the session to record some corrections, and so I realized something that I'd had on the back burner should maybe be pulled up front because time was slipping away. As is always the case with me, when I talk about what's in my head, there's going to be some meandering, but in the end, for me, it's all tied together. But we'll start with a neutral fact. I've recently started investing more in camping. I actually did more camping and hiking when I was younger, but as my responsibilities in life have grown, my downtime has become more sedentary. Still, I began to miss being outside. Outside, surrounded by a world that is less man-made. That may sound a little corny, but there's a substantial pull when I get out there to, stay out there and never come back, if I'm honest. I went to a routine physical 2 years ago, and the doctor asked me some new questions that seemed to be tied to mental health. I'm not sure if it was a new thing at the clinic or a new thing in medicine, but he was asking me things about my level of interest in activities. And for a while now, I haven't been feeling super invested in much. I find it hard to care about things, between climate change coming for us all and corrupt corporate-controlled capitalist systems constantly choosing money and property over lives both around the globe and at home. I'm sitting and watching global oppression and violence and honestly wondering if anything can stop any of this and wondering, what am I clinging to? I absolutely do not think I'm alone here. I have a feeling a lot of people are having a similar experience. Part of me wants to spend the time I have left mobilizing and doing what I can to see if the good fight can win. But part of me wants to just throw in the towel, grab a backpack, walk into the woods somewhere, and never be seen or heard from again. It's just a fantasy, though, because I'm on a maintenance drug for my thyroid, and I wouldn't last a month without it, so I can't really go too far off grid. I saw a movie a while ago called These Final Hours that examined a situation where the world was facing an imminent end due to some unexplained phenomenon that was spreading around the globe and was ending all life within a few days. So as some parts of the world were obliterated, other parts of the world were getting updates about how this event was moving and people were choosing what they wanted to do in their final hours. Climate change and corporate capitalism are like that in my mind. They leave me with a general sense of hopelessness that touches my flight or fight response. The camping bug that has revived, I believe, is my flight instinct. My outraged social media posts and resource sharing are the fight response. There are two wolves inside me. The doctor decided that my response means I have depression, or at least he suspects it. He's not qualified to diagnose it, so now it's on my record that his professional opinion is that I should see someone about my depression. I wanted to ask him if he has kids and whether he thinks there's any future left for them on this planet, and how he cannot be in a state of anxiety or defeat. Seriously, how? The next year, last year, when I came in for a visit, the physician's assistant came in to see me first. She started checking my chart. At one point, she says, "I apologize, but I have to ask you about some things based on these notes from your last visit." I already knew what it was going to be about. She started to ask me whether I was interested in things. I don't remember the exact words, but at one point she just stopped and said something like, "I know we're all going through some things right now." And again, I don't recall exact words, but it hit in a way that let me know she understood what was going on. She understood me in a way this doctor did not. So here I am, struggling between outrage and complete defeat, and it's manifesting with me in rage posting and consuming media that continues to reassure me that I have nothing to feel hopeful about. And then this escapism that is starting to bubble up in hiking and camping to the point that my online shopping carts are full of gear just waiting to be purchased, and my YouTube history is nothing but a variety of camping videos. Camping in inclement weather, camping solo, backcountry camping, car camping, gear reviews, camping gone wrong. I fell asleep one night and the algorithm had led itself down a rabbit hole to some weird prepper content. For folks who aren't up on the many faces of camping, right now I'm doing what's known as car camping or tent camping. This is where you pack up your gear in a car, you drive to a campground, and either camp in your car or pitch a tent and camp near your car. But usually in car camping of this type, you're at a location with some sort of facilities, a type of toilet, and maybe even showers. Some have water and electric hookups right there at the tent site. I've always camped this way. Sometimes I've even rented a full use or a partial use cabin. At Palo Duro Canyon, I had a small log cabin that featured electricity but no indoor water. So I had to hike down a hill to use a toilet or a shower, but I had access to toilets and showers. At Lake Brownwood, I rented a cabin with a flush toilet, a kitchenette, a shower, basically a 1930s stone and wood efficiency built by the CCC. And if you don't know what the CCC means, you need to check out the episode on the history of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The trips I'm taking now are sites I can drive to, pitch my tent not far from my car, and walk a few minutes to a shower or a toilet, but I'm also near rivers and hiking trails. I just spent a weekend at the Colorado River, and soon I'm heading to the Medina River for a week. Another type of popular camping is backcountry camping. This generally means you're bringing your camp with you in a backpack, and you hike into the backwoods for a few miles or even several miles with whatever you can carry. Some backpackers actually do some significant through hikes on trails that span multiple states. You won't have showers or toilets, although there is etiquette still around staying clean and how to deal with waste. It's just a very different culture from the type of camping that I'm doing now. But I'm finding it very alluring, so maybe I can tell my next doctor that and get those notes out of my file. The latest horror that struck me was some recent reporting about what's called administrative detention in Israel. Administrative detention is a sterilized way of saying black site. In Israel, there's a justice system similar to what we have in the US that's used by Israeli citizens. And then there is administrative detention, a separate system, which is what Palestinians are subjected to. Here's my disclaimer that I give anytime I talk about things I'm just learning about. I'm new to this, and it's based on what I've heard and footage that has been exposed. If you are interested in learning more, I encourage you to look into it yourself. I am not the expert. So we're all clear, I'm not a legal expert on this, but what I've heard so far is that people who are picked up and kept in these prisons do not need to be charged with anything and don't have much in the way of due process. I think every several months or so their case is put before a judge where it's determined if they can continue to be held, but there is no actual time limit on how long a person can be held, and there is no real oversight of what's going on in these locations. Although black sites are thought of as secret locations, I see both Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay listed as black sites. Although AI tells me if I've heard of it, it probably is not or was not a black site. I don't know if a black site has to be entirely secret or if it only has to be a secret when it comes to what's happening within the walls. I want to clarify that for the purposes of this episode, I'm saying that if illegal interrogations and torture are going on while these happenings at the facility are hidden from public view, that's what I'm considering a black site. If you think it has to be a totally secret location that nobody knows is holding prisoners for interrogation, then for you, these aren't black sites, and that's okay. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just explaining what I mean by it, whether I'm right or wrong. But as I heard about these administrative detentions, it reminded me of the US sites like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, where we grabbed civilians and locked them up without charges, without due process, without sentences, just kidnapped people and held them in horrible facilities, hidden away where brutal tortures took place, sometimes leading to murders. I remember when Obama ran for office, one of the things he campaigned on was shutting down Guantanamo. It's still operating. It's been there more than 22 years now. Obama did try to shut it down. He issued an executive order in 2009 to close it, but it's still open. I lived through a lot of both Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. Obviously, I mean that both scandals broke and were publicly aired during my living memory, not that I have any personal ties to either facility. But memory isn't always pristine, so I still like to read up on things like this and refresh my memory. I usually end up learning a little or a lot, even about things that happened in my living memory. Although it's embarrassingly ignorant, I wasn't aware that Guantanamo was located in Cuba. I knew it was offshore because one of the issues during Obama's quest to close it down was that no continental state wanted to house the prisoners out of fear of becoming a terrorist target. But Cuba seemed odd to me since U.S. relations with Cuba are crap. Obama tried to open up relations with Cuba, but since then it's gone back to the U.S. sanctioning that little nation pretty brutally. So how are we operating a torture facility there? In the late 1890s, Cuba was in the grip of colonial rule under Spain. At that time, the U.S. actually fought for Cuban independence, and Cuba eventually became an independent nation. This is also, as a side note, when we took over Puerto Rico, which remains a U.S. colonial-held territory. The price of freedom for Cuba was that it had to cede control of some of its territory to the U.S., and they weren't given much choice in that. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. So in reality, it was a unilateral decision. It was our ransom demand for Cuban quote-unquote independence. Castro eventually rose to power and told the U.S. to get out of Cuba's economy. He wanted the U.S. to leave, but he knew he was in no position to take on the U.S. military. Since then, the U.S. has been using the region as a naval base, and later, in the 1990s, it was used to house refugees from Haiti and, ironically, Cuba as well, people trying to get to the U.S. from their homelands. It wasn't until after 9/11 that the U.S. started using it as a facility to house what we claimed were al-Qaeda detainees, aka terrorists. However, like the Israeli Administrative Detention, you didn't have to be charged with anything to be thrown into Guantanamo. So while we're told these are al-Qaeda militants, nobody knows. I can't think of any time in world history where waiving due process resulted in better outcomes. Even with due process, injustice can thrive. This is a big part of the problem with sites like these. If people put into them don't have to be charged with anything, then we don't know they've actually done anything wrong. We don't know if they're actually dangerous. The question that arises is, if we know they've done something worth incarcerating them, why not allow for due process to demonstrate that before incarcerating them? If we don't have evidence to support our claims of their guilt, it's fair to ask why we believe they're guilty. It's fundamentally wrong to strip a person of their rights if they haven't been charged with any crime. I have to ask, if that were me, how would I defend myself? What would I be appealing? How could I make a case for my release if I don't even know why I'm being held? In high school, I read a novel called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It has become one of my favorite books. It's the story of a man sent to a Soviet gulag and sentenced to 10 years of forced labor without knowing what he's been incarcerated for. The book is exactly as the title describes. One day in Ivan's life in the gulag. In spite of being forced to labor in freezing conditions after waking up not feeling well and working within the prison society to secure extra rations, nothing described in the novel comes close to the depravity in the accounts of Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, or these administrative detention facilities we're now hearing about in Israel. Abu Ghraib was also born out of the 9/11 event in New York, but not directly. As is well-established history at this point, the U.S. government worked overtime to try and tie conversations around 9/11 and the events of that day with the invasion of Iraq. We didn't come out and say that Iraq perpetrated the attacks because they didn't. But we did start a very broad, very vaguely defined stream of propaganda that featured terrorism, terrorists, and wars on terror. The more I look into the U.S. use of this word, the more I think it's too often used to redefine the people we kill and exploit around the globe when they begin to gain sufficient capacity to fight back. I'm beginning to see that we do a lot of the same things we condemn terrorists of doing. Even today, regardless of your views about what's happening in Palestine, it's clear that the U.S. is supplying the weapons used to destroy huge swaths of civilian areas, with no stipulations on the use of our weapons to take care not to do so. We condemned taking out the Twin Towers, which was a dramatic attack that left a few thousand civilians dead. The people killed, we argued, were not combatants, although in other episodes I've discussed that the line between being a part of a war effort and being a civilian can sometimes be hard to define. The name World Trade Center was chosen to emphasize the complex's role as a global hub for international trade and commerce. The same trade and commerce responsible for much of the horrifying violence and poverty inflicted on the global South. And while I'm not going to get into motivations about that attack, it says a lot that so many social media channels were shut down simply for asking audiences to read the letter to America from Osama bin Laden. Let me say as well that there are different versions of this letter floating around. At the U.S. Archive, I found one that is 10 pages and another that is 4. The morning that the strange letter from bin Laden content went viral, channels were being shut down. So I found the one that was being used at The Guardian, the one in question, and I downloaded it before they pulled it down. I had no idea what was going on, but there was something fundamentally wrong about trying to stop people from reading a letter. I'm including a link to an archived longer version that differs a bit from the one I downloaded in case anyone is curious. The one I downloaded points to some of what the U.S. is responsible for abroad. Some of it was more about religious ideology. When I saw the content creators who shared it out more recently, they seemed to think it was paradigm shifting. I didn't see it as that, but they were a lot younger, and I don't know what they've learned or not learned about the United States history or foreign policy yet. Not everyone living today remembers the War on Terror and the U.S. lies around the Iraq invasion. Maybe for some of these young people, it was paradigm shifting. There were conspiracies around the sharing of the letter, and there was a lot of talk of the Streisand effect. I have no idea. I actually don't care if people read it or don't read it. I have talked about free speech in other episodes and how the government has a hand in all sorts of private avenues to shut it down. I'm not saying there aren't ethical questions around giving a voice or a platform to people who do violence on a massive scale. Obviously, we don't want to encourage the idea that if you kill a lot of people, you'll get your message out. I personally am interested, though, in what it was that got someone to kill a bunch of people. It doesn't mean I'll agree with their cause. It doesn't mean I will consider what they did justified. But if we don't investigate the motivations and it's tied to a movement and violence in response is the only tool in our box, What happens if someone actually has a legitimate grievance and is denied access to due process in order to have their case heard? I'm not suggesting that having a grievance justifies mass killing. I am suggesting that there are some situations that drive people to extremes, like the crabs in the pot analogy. Whether the various actions any crab may take are justified, if we want them to stop fighting each other to get out of the boiling pot, the best solution is to turn off the heat, not clamp down on the lid. Not all grievances or movements are equal. But that's exactly why we need more than one approach. And pushback on colonialism will result in escalation, atrocities, and ultimately should be met with less heat, not tighter lids. This is why I talked about Star Trek, the movie Into Darkness, in another episode. It wrestles with many of these same questions about the terrorist label and how it's used to subvert justice rather than achieve it. The movie portrays a terrorist doing a seemingly random act of violence resulting in many innocent deaths. Later, we learn why the man did what he did and how the leadership wasn't fully honest about the situation, and that innocuous target wasn't random at all but strategic. The people killed were actually supporting offensive military aspirations. And suddenly, what this terrorist did becomes understandable, even potentially justified. And the man sent to hunt him down and illegally execute him becomes conflicted and even aligns with this terrorist on common goals. Ultimately, however, the hunter decides the right thing to do is to bring this man back to stand trial, not illegally murder him or release him. So while he gains some sympathy for the cause of this terrorist, he still believes that he should have a trial to assess his actions and the deaths that resulted. Social media channels in the US were shut down for telling people to go read a letter, not for saying everyone should bomb buildings. I've mentioned before that most bookstores and libraries carry copies of Mein Kampf. Bin Laden's letter to America is literally addressed to America. It's written to me, not to President Bush or the US military or the CIA, but to the American public. It's my mail. Everyone who reads it will have a different response to it, and I fully understand why some people wouldn't want to read it at all. But why is reading this letter so threatening to the most powerful nation on earth? No one has to agree with the letter or agree it's even worth reading. But this is an example of the power of the term terrorist. Kirk was ready to break the law, to summarily execute a man he didn't know, to ignore the fact that there was no trial and that he knew nothing about the motives driving this other man's actions. If it were only something found in fiction, I wouldn't care. But this is how it plays out in real life. This is art imitating life to a T. I talked about Khan's speech in that episode where he asked Kirk, "Is there anything you would not do for your family?" Kirk is rendered speechless, and it's clear that after hearing Khan's explanation of what he's done, and more importantly, why he's done it, Kirk is having to rethink, to reprocess everything he thought he knew. He has only moments to reconsider the entire mission and whether or not to believe this man's story, which comes with some supporting evidence, not just that he's telling the truth, but also that the full story hasn't been shared out with Kirk by the people who approved his mission, that the facts he was given may have been strategically incomplete. Call someone a terrorist, and you can grab them off the street without an explanation. Call someone a terrorist, and you can throw them in a dungeon for however long you want to. Deny them due process, torture them, kill them, not tell their families you have them, drag them across the ocean, and even lie to your own nation about what you're doing and why. The person you're imprisoning doesn't even have to be guilty of anything. To call this highly problematic is an understatement. Call someone a terrorist, and you can shut down a content creator for saying they wrote a letter that you suggest other people read. It's easy to dismiss some folks on TikTok because right now there's a big propaganda push going on to vilify the platform. But we recently saw a journalist arrested on terrorism-related charges over reporting on resistance movements. Richard Medhurst was arrested shortly after his plane landed at UK's Heathrow Airport. He was quoted as saying, quote, "I criticized the Terrorism Act before getting on the plane, then got arrested under the Terrorism Act upon landing. Can't make this up," end quote. He said he was arrested under Section 12 of the Terrorism Act of 2000, and that he was accused of, quote, "expressing an opinion or belief that is supportive of a prescribed organization," unquote. He additionally noted that when he asked for clarification on what that actually means, no one would or could explain it. What Medhurst describes is that Hamas has been branded as a terrorist group, and support for Palestine has been conflated with support for Hamas. Therefore, if you write articles supporting Palestinian rights, you're spreading Hamas ideology, or what the UK seems to be saying is terrorist ideology. This is the power of the label terrorist. We are witnessing large global movements in support of Palestine in these days. Seeing the Middle East blow up as it has, a lot of people saw October 7th, and many of us reacted to that with an outpouring of sympathy for the victims, for the hostages taken from Israel. But in the days that followed, other narratives surfaced about the days just prior to October 7th, when many Palestinians had been killed, and even the years before, going all the way back to an event known as the Nakba at the end of the 1940s. Films like Tantura dusted off events from the 1990s and provided them for consideration. As people began to learn more, many of them had a very Kirk-like reaction, rethinking their original responses and their understanding of the entire situation. Trump's Abraham Accords and Biden's continuation of that policy rebranded as normalizing relations with Israel. Israel has strained relations with its neighbors. A lot of it is tied to Palestine. From what I can discern, the reason for this policy is to ask those neighbors to work cooperatively with Israel and ignore the plight of the Palestinian territories. And by ask, I mean threaten and cajole, carrot and stick until you get everyone to agree. Depending on your level of cynicism, you might read this as a harbinger of dark days to come for Palestine once these agreements are solidified. This is why we saw Palestinian protests when Jared Kushner was there negotiating parts of this deal. We still are, asking the regional powers to please look the other way at what happens to Palestinians. And again, this is what was in the works leading up to October 7th. When I was in high school or college, I recall seeing cartoons of Israeli soldiers standing on a tall wall shooting Palestinian children who were firing slingshots. The idea that a lot of people didn't realize there were even competing narratives tied to this situation was an eye-opener for me. I won't sit here and say that I knew growing up everything that I've learned in the past year, but I knew there were two sides to the story. One of my Jewish friends had gone on a birthright trip during high school and come back conflicted with stories about how she didn't like how the Palestinians were being treated. Some of the folks who didn't realize there was a Palestinian narrative are around my own age. So I can't really even say this is a generational thing. I mean, Biden is much older than I am, and clearly he seems unaware as well, even after having a lot of involvement in policy tied to that region. It isn't that I don't believe there can be evil people in the world who do damage to terrify other people, but I think it's far more likely that people doing violence in a planned and methodical way, a large-scale way, have an actual motivation that goes beyond just trying to scare people. If your goal is merely to scare people, you don't write them several pages of a letter to explain what you're doing and why. Maybe it's just me, but I imagine that not owning the strike and leaving people to wonder who did it and why would be a much more frightening scenario. Timothy McVeigh is another guy who did a load of damage. He often quoted from a novel based on white supremacist ideology and was afraid the government was coming to take his guns away. Neither of these issues speaks to me, but it opens a can of worms so that you can start to ask how he came to these ideas and who is propagating them and what they're trying to accomplish. I watched a weird video the other night featuring a political strategist, Robert Pape, who surveyed the folks arrested on January 6th. He said that the white supremacist replacement theories were a major motivating factor. The people involved weren't struggling financially and were disgruntled about seeing their white privilege diminishing. I have no love for either of those causes, but understanding what's at work matters. You can't resolve legitimate movements or push back on harmful ones unless you begin to understand what forces are at work. Do I support a cause? Do I not? How do I know? And just because my government doesn't support it, or does not automatically mean I'm going to agree. And don't I have a right to disagree with what my government does and to speak out against it? I suppose we could respond by infiltrating the movement and killing those involved, like we did with some civil rights movements that we branded as militant. We could go full McCarthy and destroy the lives of anyone who believes similar things or speaks out against the use of questionable or illegal tactics. But we need better tools to diffuse situations that drive mass violence. If more violence is our only tool, and we can't look past our own pain to try and understand that other people may also be in pain, we are doomed. What good are we as citizens if we're going to simply toe a government line? One that often shows a willingness, if not an eagerness, to trade lives for money. A person or group's reasons may or may not be productive or helpful to a society, and nobody has to agree with a movement's goals or methods. The moment I say there are no movements that, someone will find one. But I can say that at this time, I don't know of any movements that have invested significant time, money, effort, and planning to have terror as a sole or even primary motivation. It's clear, for example, that the targets on 9/11 were not random. They were strategic. The Pentagon, presumably the White House, and the World Trade Towers. The U.S. seat and symbols of military, government, and economy. The trifecta of tools we use to do violence around the world. There are plenty of other better voices available who can talk about that history of corporate colonialism and exploitation of people and resources, which birthed this nation and continue to this day as our foreign policy. But that's not my goal with this episode. Channels like Second Thought and Democracy Now! Do a much deeper dive into these types of histories. If you go to YouTube and search for colonial coups or U.S. coups, you can find hours and hours of content to consume. If that's your thing, help yourself. Specifically, maybe look up Chiquita. In the back of my mind, as I scripted this and re-scripted it again because it is such a volatile topic, I knew that saying that after reading the bin Laden letter, I understood some of what he was describing. I was saying that, having watched the event as it happened and the subsequent images and video replays on television and online showing the victims plummeting to horrifying deaths. I know there are family and friends still living and first responders, people traumatized from having gone through it themselves. Those images are branded into our brains, and we can see the brutality of that act, and that means we cannot ask why. We cannot read his letter and say, okay, I understand this man's position, even if we denounce the actions. The only narrative that is allowed is that this was an evil and depraved person who was part of an evil and depraved group that radicalized people into extremist acts, and there is no reason to listen to anything someone like this has to say. And I will point out that there are voices who express the same complaints bin Laden does in this letter about the global north and brutal colonialism, who have not brought down buildings and taken thousands of lives in a single act. So it's fair to say that a person can understand these same ideas by reading or listening to other sources. And maybe that's a better way to consume the information. It could be that acts like 9/11 do more harm to a movement by turning people off from listening than they do to bring attention to a movement. That is, I remember the images of 9/11, but I don't think I ever opened the letter to America until it broke recently on social media. If I had been in New York City and lived through 9/11 or lost loved ones, my position could easily be that it's grotesque to even look at anything this man has to say. I can fully understand how a person can say that something they experienced was so bad that they don't care why someone did it. I can understand them hating others for even asking or caring why. But should a journalist be arrested for seeking out the perpetrators or the resistance or the terrorists and asking them to tell their story? That's part of the news story. If a person asks why or suggests others ask why, do we want them arrested? Even the channels that were sanctioned, I can understand a government having a concern about that sort of social violence. Similar to how I'd want an individual to be investigated if they started suggesting that they were going to get violent with another individual. I'm not telling anyone else what to think about it. I'm saying that something in my own head sees a difference between justifying what was done or promoting it versus saying that you understand the person's thinking or that some of their points that they raise in their manifesto were things that you didn't know or that you learned by reading it. Even if someone thought the letter was brilliant, and let me be clear, I am not saying that, if they aren't advocating for or justifying the violence, isn't that just an opinion on an idea? My question isn't rhetorical, though. I have a feeling some folks think it should be illegal and others probably not. Still, the aftermath of 9/11 involves some horrifying responses from the U.S. Lies, wars, torture, abuse, slaughter. Rather than respond to the issue, we used it to launch all kinds of new horrors onto the world. Terrorist or terrorist sympathizer became the new communist or communist sympathizer of the McCarthy era. It's become not just a label that says, I don't have to hear anything you have to say, but a label that says, I don't have to recognize you're a human being. I don't have to grant you any of the rights that I say are important to all human beings to have. What do we do when the rhetoric around terrorism starts to extend past the edges? What if someone labeled a terrorist and using questionable methods has a good cause? I remember someone asking Norm Finkelstein about how he reconciles slogans like "Death to Jews" with his refusal to condemn groups that use slogans like those, specifically Ansar Allah or the Houthis. Finkelstein told a story about his parents who both survived concentration camps in Germany in World War II. He explained his parents hated Germans, not Nazis, but Germans. He related some conversations with his parents to illustrate, but then said that if there had been a militant group fighting back on their behalf, even one using questionable methods and slogans that grouped all Germans in with Nazis, he thinks they probably would have felt supportive of that group because when the only experience you have with the people in a group is horrible, you may form opinions about that whole group based on those horrible experiences. Finkelstein isn't saying it's reasonable or justified. He's saying it's understandable, that he can understand it. It makes sense to him even though he can see the problems with it. Some people may get where Finkelstein is coming from. Others may find his answer completely unsatisfying. And that's okay. I'm not here to tell anyone what to think about it. These are just connections my brain makes around these issues. In the end, this label, terrorist, ended up justifying these black sites. I'm not saying we didn't have them before 9/11. I'm saying that after 9/11, we actually launched a big effort to justify them as both legal and ethical. And the administrative detention in Israel appears to follow the same model. Charges are not required. This is why you sometimes hear Palestinians refer to their people who are detained as hostages. I've noticed that when I see Israeli debates about these detainees, it's all about how they are Hamas and the horrors they're responsible for, totally forgetting that the people we're talking about haven't actually been charged with anything, and we haven't actually seen any evidence they've done anything wrong. Recently, a group of doctors and medical workers were released and talked about the torture and abuse that they endured and what they saw while they were held in this facility. So the justification for abducting these people without charges or due process is that they're terrorists. But the fact they're not charged and are denied due process means you don't actually have any good case that they've done anything wrong. And yet, in a soft logic way, the implication is that if they're in there, they must be horrible people. So when we're defending murder and torture of detainees, we're using terrorism as our justification. But when we abduct these people, no case is required to demonstrate that they're actually terrorists. So it's circular. We picked them up and tortured and murdered them because they're terrorists. And if they weren't terrorists, then they wouldn't have ended up in our prison being tortured and murdered. You're guilty until proven innocent, and you're given no opportunity to prove your innocence. So you're just guilty by decree. While I was looking into the US black sites, I came across something called the Torture Memos. As I was reading them, I started to see a trend. A lawyer named John Yoo seemed determined to justify torture and murder of detainees. His answers to questions around the laws that should govern these sites that the U.S. has set up around the globe, by the way, not just at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, seemed to be saying that there is no law surrounding their treatment. So do whatever you think is necessary. He would argue that since they weren't strictly affiliated with a legitimate nation state, they weren't really combatants, and so laws and rules around the treatment of combatants or prisoners of war didn't apply, even though we literally called it a war on terror. Then when asked if they were civilians, he would say that, well, technically no, they were fighting, so they shouldn't be protected by laws that dictate the treatment of civilians. In the end, he seemed to think that no protection of any kind applied. There was a lot of documentation around something called enhanced interrogation techniques. A lawyer named Jay Bybee had his hands all over this part of the situation. Enhanced interrogation was a 50-cent word for torture. It was a way of saying, we're going to torture these people, potentially to death, but we're not doing torture. We're just not letting them sleep at all. We're just waterboarding them. We're just doing things that ended up killing them that no one needs to know about. I'm going to include links in the description if anyone wants to read these memos or see the articles around these sites and these situations. When the news around the extensive abuses at Abu Ghraib broke, it was a scandal. But as these memos and interviews show, this was by design. It wasn't people going rogue. This was our government at the highest levels giving a wink and a nod to the US military and the CIA and telling them to go full Wild West with these Middle East nations because terrorism would be a get-out-of-jail-free card to ensure that legally no rules applied. During the development of some of these memos, there were some people who objected to this type of policy. Colin Powell argued that the Geneva Convention should be applied as some type of legal framework to use as guidance over these engagements. In March 2003, to quote from one of the links I'm supplying, quote, a memorandum prepared by a Defense Department legal task force drew on the January and August memorandums to declare that President Bush was not bound by either an international treaty prohibiting torture or by a federal anti-torture law because he had the authority as Commander-in-Chief to approve any technique needed to protect the nation's security. The memorandum also said that executive branch officials, including those in the military, could be immune from domestic and international prohibitions against torture for a variety of reasons, unquote. Shortly after October 7th, I remember Biden standing up and saying something about how Israel should not repeat the mistakes the U.S. made after 9/11. I knew what he was talking about, although not nearly in as much detail as I know now. It seems the events that followed October 7th have been like looking in a mirror for me as a U.S. citizen. Every report of abuse or massacre, I think to myself, that reminds me of when the U.S. did this or that. And the administrative detention, as soon as I heard that people were detained without charges, I thought of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. Both of them, mistakes we made after 9/11. More recently, a video surfaced showing IDF soldiers abusing a prisoner to the point he needed to be hospitalized. I want to talk about what happened, but it's brutal and explicit. You can look it up. Use the R word for sure. And again, I thought about the US black sites where people who may have never known why they were picked up and being held were tortured and imprisoned without any way to communicate their whereabouts or what was happening to them, where they died in ways I can't imagine. I want to share some quotes from some of the resources supplied in the description. Thomas Powers, the author of 2 books about the CIA, is quoted as saying, quote, "I've never heard of anyone at the CIA being convicted of a killing," unquote. John Sifton, a lawyer for Human Rights Watch, questioned whether the then Attorney General Alberto Gonzales had too many conflicts of interest to weigh the case against Swanner fairly. Sifton said, "It's hard to imagine the current leadership pursuing these guys because the head of the Justice Department, Alberto Gonzales, is centrally implicated in crafting the policies that led to the abuse," unquote. The reference in the quote to Swanner is Mark Swanner, a CIA operative who tortured a prisoner to death at Abu Ghraib. You may recall an episode where I talked about how the government scrubs information about operatives from the internet. I once located the house of an FBI agent because it was the only house in the vicinity for which an owner was not listed. And yes, I was able to confirm I had located the correct house. When you read the article on Abu Ghraib, Swanner is named as the CIA operative responsible for the most notorious death case, and yet his name is not linked to anything in Wikipedia. You can find photos and interviews and articles discussing him online, but what you can't find about this notorious killer tied to a notorious murder that shook the nation and achieved international infamy is a wiki page about him. But he was quoted as saying that the man he tortured to death provided no information. And is this surprising? Torture, we know, does not work. And I'll go out on a limb and say it especially doesn't work when you're using it on people you don't even know are involved in what you're trying to get information about. It didn't work for the Spanish Inquisition. It doesn't work today. It's just abusing people to abuse them. Here is a final quote. Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois who was then on the Senate Intelligence Committee, saw the full classified set of photographs from Abu Ghraib. He said, "You can't imagine what it's like to go to a closed room where you have a classified briefing and stand shoulder to shoulder with your colleagues in the Senate and see hundreds and hundreds of slides like those of Abu Ghraib, most of which have never been publicly disclosed. I had a sick feeling when I left. It was then I began to have suspicions something significant was happening at the highest levels of the government when it came to torture policy," unquote. While I was reading about it, I wondered what happened to these people. It seems no one is ever held to account, certainly no one up the chain. And since this is a very generic question, I went to Wikipedia, a very generic source, where it provided the following. In response to the events at Abu Ghraib, the United States Department of Defense removed 17 soldiers and officers from duty. 11 soldiers were charged with dereliction of duty, maltreatment, aggravated assault, and battery. Between May 2004 and April 2006, these soldiers were court-martialed, convicted, sentenced to military prison, and dishonorably discharged from the service. 2 soldiers, found to have perpetuated many of the worst offenses at the prison, Specialist Charles Grainer and PFC Lindy England, were subject to more severe charges and received harsher sentences. Grainer was convicted of assault, battery, conspiracy, maltreatment of detainees, committing indecent acts, and dereliction of duty. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and loss of rank, pay, and benefits. England was convicted of conspiracy, maltreating detainees, and committing an indecent act and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Brigadier General Janis Karpinski, the commanding officer of all detention facilities in Iraq, was reprimanded and demoted to the rank of colonel. Several more military personnel accused of perpetuating or authorizing the measures, including many of higher rank, were not prosecuted. In 2004, President George W. Bush and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld apologized for the Abu Ghraib abuses. So after doing all they could to greenlight abuse and torture in this prison, those at the top issued an apology. Those at the bottom were scapegoated. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have paid for their role, not at all. I'm saying the people who created that Wild West scenario should have seen more accountability than issued apologies. Again, the mistakes we made after 9/11, letting the criminal masterminds walk away scot-free. While I was watching clips of what was going on with some of the released Palestinian hostages and thinking of the U.S. black sites, I then saw a clip of government officials there arguing over whether the IDF guards should be allowed to sexually abuse and torture prisoners. And this struck me as going beyond what I remember happening in the U.S. government. I am sure that there were citizens who held those views about anyone being held, because there are always people who believe that if you've done nothing wrong, you wouldn't be in custody, and if you're in custody, they don't care how you're treated. Those are pretty horrible people. And as I mentioned before, Abu Ghraib was a scandal that was met by a lot of public outrage and even congressional pushback by lawmakers. I don't remember any debates in Congress where anyone advocated sexual abuse of prisoners. This isn't making the same mistakes we made after 9/11. This is something different. Then I watched videos of the mobs of Israeli citizens who were attacking the prison where the IDF soldiers were being detained. Remember, these are soldiers who were videotaped sexually abusing a detainee so brutally that he had to be hospitalized. But I thought to myself, these are like MAGA. They don't believe the video evidence, or they haven't seen it. They probably believe that the most moral army narrative about the IDF is true, and they don't believe these stories or allegations. As they started to speak out, a horror sank in. They did believe it. They knew it. But like the lawmakers, they were arguing that there are no red lines, no stipulations or restrictions on what the IDF should be able to do to a detainee. They weren't outraged because they believed in the innocence of these guards. They were outraged that they were being held to account for brutal sexual abuse. At one point, one of the government officials who's defending these men asks incredulously, "Do you know what these prisoners have done?" He's talking about the terrorist actions, and again, these people aren't charged with anything. So in truth, no, we don't know what this man did. We don't know what any of these people have done, if anything, or if they're just innocent civilians being used to pay the price for a revenge wish where literally any Palestinian will do. And I'm watching this and thinking, these are the people I am arming and funding with my tax dollars. The truth is, I don't care how much of an ally someone is. Having no stipulations on how your weapons are used as you're sending them means you are responsible for the atrocities that follow. Just as Bush greenlit torture, the U.S. today is greenlighting war crimes. As a U.S. citizen, I am responsible for the civilian deaths that follow, for the polio case we just saw emerge. What is wrong with telling someone they need to show a good faith effort to use your weapons in accordance with international law, with your own domestic law, that they need to adhere to international human rights laws? The U.S. puts sanctions on a handful of West Bank settlers for violence, but the ICJ has just deemed that the entire settlement is an illegal annexation and occupation of the land. So why is the U.S. singling out a handful of people there to sanction? The entire settlement should be sanctioned, as it's running afoul of international law. And even as I write this script, violence in the West Bank is escalating, and now the Palestinians there are finally beginning to push back. We're about to see another Gaza-Palestine in the Palestinian West Bank. It seems what Biden was saying was he hoped they wouldn't make the same mistakes the U.S. made after 9/11. But if they do, then meh, what are you going to do? It was disappointing to hear Harris express more condemnation for the burning of a U.S. flag than the burning to death of tens of thousands of Palestinian children by bombs decorated with those same U.S. flags. There's some doublespeak happening here, or some kind of disconnect. Proxy wars are a thing. And in the U.S., we back and arm other smaller nations or rebel factions in order to install leadership that is more open to allowing U.S. to come in and exploit resources and labor to get it out of the hands of local populations, who are often indigenous people. We then go in with humanitarian aid saying we're trying to help. And if the people themselves fight back and gain the ability to do actual damage, then we call them terrorists. So we come in, we steal the land and the resources, and we give control to a government we prop up, then arm them or even put our own boots on the ground to help them hold control over the indigenous population we're robbing and exploiting, sometimes to death. I remember in the episode about genocide, the book that detailed the list of things to watch for. One was that at some point it will be labeled as a humanitarian crisis and dealt with by sending humanitarian aid. After we destroy people's access to their own resources, we then use the poverty and starvation we engineered to say it's a humanitarian crisis. And all of this is part of an ongoing colonialism, the model that the U.S. was founded on and that we've never stopped. We are still doing it today. Part of me hopes that it's becoming more apparent to more people as I see protests around the globe and labor unions backing some of those. But after every such uprising, it seems that the people are handed something to lull us back to sleep, and then we go right back to business as usual. So that hope today, even watching this global awakening against colonialist movements, is hanging by a frayed thread. My doctor left the clinic. So currently, I don't have a general practitioner, a regular doctor. The clinic has sent me some reminders that I'm due for an annual checkup, so I should probably pick a new doctor. I don't think, though, that anyone confronted by what we're seeing in these days should be expected to get excited about the new season of their favorite TV series or the latest fashion or their pets or potentially even their kids. I'm not going to harsh on people finding joy wherever they can. You do you. But I'm also not going to sit here saying that it's wrong to feel despair while you watch the world burn. If you are one of those people who is not feeling particularly okay right now or haven't been for a while, I'm here to say it's okay to not feel okay when things aren't okay. There is some seriously messed up stuff we're seeing and experiencing. And I don't think it's wrong to ask if the whole world has gone completely off the rails and how anyone can be going about life as usual. I'm right there with you. And I know a lot of other people going through the same thing, for what that's worth. I don't think it's an accident that this particular old hobby is coming back to me in this moment. That of all the things that could be happening, wanting to throw basic necessities into a bag and escape into parts of the world where there aren't many or any other people is where my head is taking me. I used to want to set up a cozy cottage house and make it my own and fill it with things I love. But every day I care less and less because hope is growing thinner and thinner. And it's not a mental health issue, Doc. It's a reality issue. Is it honestly shocking that the one thing that has my interest right now is a hobby that is literally described as getting away from it all? That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.